Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to share a little bit about how I got interested in the ECM. About 8-9 months ago, there was an article in the UDK about the developers of the Oriad Hotel offering to demolish this building and build a new one and let THAD and the ECM rent from them. That was kind of how I saw the story. And that disturbed me because I love this building. I went to college here and attended various functions here, and I just loved the architecture of the building. I didn't quite understand how important it was historically to our community until I started doing some research. And about 7-8 years ago, we founded a group called Lawrence Modern, and basically it's a group of people who really appreciate 1950s, 60s architecture and design. You know, indeed, something a mere 50 years old can be historic. It's hard to believe, especially when maybe you have been around a while. It's hard to believe something that young can be important, but it's true. And historians are calling this era the recent past. So I started interviewing people in February, and I just started with asking Thad, who should I interview? And it just kind of led to one interview after another. Interviewed a lot of people at the Presbyterian Manor. Seemed like, you know, if you're involved with the ECM and needed some help, you eventually go to the Presbyterian Manor if you're lucky. So I had many great interviews there with people who were able to share their memories about this building. I would also like to ask forgiveness because many of you know this building and the history of this building so much better than Leslie and I. So we just have started this a year ago, and you've lived it. So please be gentle with us. The photos that we're using today come from the Spencer Archives and also 2 scrapbooks that Thad loaned us that were created. One was created in the late 20s, I think, and the other one in the late 1940s, early 50s. So now I'd like to introduce Leslie Tuttle. She has been instrumental in pulling this together. She's assistant professor of history at KU, and she's going to be talking about the early years and to the construction of the ECM.
Thank you all very much, and thanks so much for coming. And I also want to stress that I am, by training, a historian of early modern France. So what I'm going to be talking about today is very, very far away from my academic, my base of knowledge. So keep that in mind. The building that we are standing in, the ECM, opened in 1961 as the United Presbyterian Center. Throughout this part of the talk, I'm going to make an argument. And that argument is that to understand this very quintessentially modern building, we need to cast a glance back at the previous homes of Presbyterian campus ministry at KU. The Presbyterian Church targeted KU for one of its very first campus missions beginning in 1905. The building that you see here, which used to stand at 1125 Tennessee Street, was that ministry's first home. The reason for the Presbyterian Church's decision to come to KU probably owed something to the fact that a large percentage of KU's students declared themselves to be from a Presbyterian background. A 1909 pamphlet, which was aimed at potential donors, so keep that in mind about the accuracy of this information, but it claimed that more than 20% of KU's 2,000 students came from Presbyterian homes. Tom's going to click now to show you what's on this spot today. Preservation is important. The Presbyterian student ministry bore fruit here, and soon plans were afoot for a permanent home. That dream was realized in the construction of this building, Westminster Hall, a lovely, monumental brick building that used to stand at 1221 Oriad Avenue, currently the site of the Union parking garage. Let's go back to look at Westminster, shall we? Westminster shaped the development of campus ministry, Presbyterian campus ministry at KU. It was, if we were to contrast it to this building, really more of a house than a public building. Although it was the home of a religious community, its functions were very domestic kinds of functions. It served, for example, as living space for female students who earned their rent by helping out in the kitchen. It had no formal worship space. To speak about that kitchen at Westminster Hall, you should know that it was, in many respects, the heart of the ministry's work and enterprise then. Part of the need that campus ministries filled in those days stemmed from the fact that college dormitories did not serve meals on Sundays. That was the day when many students gathered with others of their denomination for service and for eating. In doing so, of course, they were very consciously returning to the roots of Christian worship in house churches in the very earliest days of the church, and that's something that you see them talking about from time to time. The Westminster Foundation newsletters that came out, I think, either every semester or quarterly. But the story of the building that we are in probably owes more to these people, John and Celeste Patton, to anybody else or any other force. John Patton did his PhD at Johns Hopkins, where he trained as a specialist in Old Testament archaeology and Semitic studies. He published a dissertation on Canaanite influences in the Book of Psalms. Seemingly much closer to the ground than these kinds of concerns, the Pattons took up the task of directing Presbyterian ministry here at KU. And they were here from 1946, I think, after John Patton ceased his service as a chaplain in World War II. They came here to KU, and they were here until 1961. Thus, they were here in the period in which this building was planned, designed, and actually constructed. Dale and Pat Rummer, who were active members of the Presbyterian community in this era, actually John Patton married them, told Tom that the design of this building was really an answer to the Pattons' dream of having, first of all, a real place of worship and, very importantly, a kitchen adequate to the task of feeding their ever-growing student congregation. Now, to understand the Pattons' challenges, it's useful to recall that their ministry coincided with a very dramatic growth in the college population in the era after World War II. The number of students at KU rose sharply, up 63% from its pre-war levels by 1950, and it continued to grow after that. All these new students put a great deal of pressure on the physical plant of the university, Westminster House included. Some of the pictures from this era, which were preserved in that scrapbook that Tom talked about, convey to you a sense of just the incredible crowding. Students crowded onto sofas, filling every available chair. Westminster Hall was a buzzing hive of activity that was kind of outgrowing its brick structure. I mentioned that the Rummers were married by John Patton. I should tell you that marriage notices, in fact, filled the monthly Westminster Foundation newsletters. By all accounts, Westminster Hall was a really great place to meet members of the opposite sex. And John Patton drove all over the Midwest, and perhaps even he flew some of those places, something Tom will mention. He drove all over the Midwest to officiate at weddings for students. I just have to talk about this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures from the scrapbook. This is, I think, a courting photo from Westminster Hall, and you'll see this very suave gentleman over here who is really trying to make a play for those ladies on the sofa. Their body language says they are not having any of it, though. It's one of my favorite pictures. While students had fun at Westminster Hall, it was also a place that was a center of community service. Every summer, the Pattons took students to New Mexico or Arizona to do work in Native American communities, and Tom and I are pretty convinced that some of the rugs that are on the walls come from those trips. So those were contributed by Celeste Patton to the building. All these pictures, which I love, place the Pattons in the denominational setting of Westminster. And that's important, but I think one of the things that's most important is something that we don't have any pictures of, I'm sorry to say, and that's how active the Pattons were in efforts to organize interdenominational and ecumenical movements in Lawrence and at KU. Celeste Patton, was president of the United Churchwomen in Lawrence, a group that I discovered from Rusty Mulholland's wonderful book about Lawrence, was very active in the civil rights struggle here. As a member of that organization, she initiated a movement to found a council of churches in Lawrence, a group that would bind the denominations together for a common enterprise. John Patton, for his part, served as Presbyterian representative to the Kansas University Religious Advisors, a group which united the various denominational pastors that worked with students at the university, as well as priests and rabbis. It was a truly ecumenical group. That group was organized in the Pattons' living room in 1946, shortly after they arrived at KU. Now, I have to talk about an archive experience now. I am a historian, and we love these. It was when I went to the university archives and I started reading the minutes of the Kansas University Religious Advisors that I first really began to understand the spirit that I think animates and helps to explain the form, the existence of this building. Patton was a very vocal member of that group. Some of his fellow pastors would have certainly said that he was a too vocal member of that group. By the late 1950s, that's shortly before the Pattons would leave, Patton was chafing against what he considered to be the very outmoded institutional forms that sorted students into their respective denominational boxes. When you arrived at KU in those days, apparently, you filled out a form and there was a box for you to check about what your religious affiliation is. And based on that indication of your religious affiliation, you would be invited to a meet your church gathering during orientation week. The KURA also sponsored what was known as Religious Emphasis Week, where the different members of the organization would invite speakers on religious issues to campus for a kind of mission week where you could hear high-quality speakers on religious issues. By the late 1950s, though, as Patton complained, the efforts of the KURA, the things that had made Meet Your Church activities at orientation week, those things were just not appealing to students anymore. They were greeted with enormous apathy. In response to those changing spiritual needs of the student population, John Patton, this is what I loved, rose at one of those meetings, the KURA meetings in January of 1961, to give what the minutes, normally those very dry kinds of records of meetings, what the minutes called, quote, a dissertation in which he pointed out that we must realize and understand the kind of revolution that is taking place in the soul of man, economically, socially, and politically. That speech was extended into a paper that he presented to his colleagues at their meeting the following month. This is that paper. It's entitled The World Revolution and the Campus Ministry. He extends his arguments there. I'm quoting from that. John Patton asks, is God dying on the campus? With Nietzsche, I would answer yes. He is dead, if by that is meant the God of Religious Emphasis Week. What to do? Patton proposed a new ecumenical approach involving cooperation specifically among the Christian denominations, including sharing of space and expenses, the practical considerations, but also something deeper, meeting among the different groups for study of religious issues and heightened interaction among faculty, students, and staff. Patton's vision for a new approach to campus ministry was an ecumenical vision. It was, I think, a deeply modern vision. And I would like to think it helps to explain some of the things that you see around you in this building. With no further ado, I'm going to turn the mic now over to Tom to talk about how this vision was realized in a structure.
Yeah, these are some great photos. Bill Keene and Jack Bradley were the architects for the ECM. Their firm was out of Topeka, and Bill and Jack were out of the first wave of architects to graduate after World War II. A lot of kids started school in 47 and graduated in 51, 52. And Warren Corman told me that both were just very talented and in the modernist vein, and that was just sort of what KU taught at the time. So it makes sense that two local architects helped create this building, and I think along with Celeste and John Patton. Let's see, B.A. Green, our local construction company, was the contractor, and I didn't realize that until I saw a little B.A. Green 1950s camper on the construction site. The building is 18,000 square feet. So you think of our homes, 1,500 to 2,500 square feet, 18,000. So just huge. This is one of my favorites, John Patton on a bulldozer at the groundbreaking. I mean, how many pastors would do that? He was also a pilot, so pretty interesting guy. I spoke with Robert Green, the son of Basil Green, and asked him about his memories of the building. And one of the things that he talked about was the barrel roof, the little humps up there. It's called barrel roof. I'd never heard that term. And he remembered the staircase as being pretty impressive. He also thought the building was just strange. He wasn't so taken by the building, and that was all I got out of him. I'm going to read a quote from the KUWF newsletter about the construction of the building. The construction of the building was an exciting time. All those who visit the building are enthusiastic about it. The visitors join the KU Westminster Foundation Committee and students in thinking it is an extremely handsome building and marvel at the convenience and the functional aspects woven into beauty and design. What a great way to describe your new campus ministry building. So the building was completed at a cost of around $300,000 without taking out a loan. Talk about fundraising. Wow, they must have been busy to raise that much money. And I understand John Patton just knew everybody, and he was a good networker, and he got the job done. Almost 48 years ago, November 12th, 1960, the building was dedicated, and Pat Rummer remembered that there was a big party here, and Celeste put down some of her rugs that she had purchased. It was a really exciting time when the building opened. The kitchen, I took that about a month ago, and my sense is that's probably the way it looked in 1960. Usually homes need their kitchens remodeled about once every 20, 25 years. So I think it's remarkable that, it still looks as good as it does. It's clearly tired. There's, I think, one or two, there might be two skylights there. There's skylights really all over the building, which is kind of neat. There's one over the chapel there that shines down. That's very pretty. Just brings more light in. Sadly, after a little more than a year, the Pattons left their ministry. They had given themselves over to for 15 years. They were here. And the only person who's outlasted them is Thad. I think he's on 17 years or so. Yeah? Okay. John Patton accepted a study leave grant from the Board of Christian Education and United Presbyterian Church in order to study religion, culture and history, art and archaeology in the Near East at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon. So that's where he left. And, it'd be interesting if any of you knew of, any underlying reasons why he left. I would love to hear your opinion of that, because to put so much energy into creating this building and then you leave in a year, there had to have been something going on there. So I haven't been able to get that from anybody. John Patton addressed his friends in the newsletter. Dear friends, leaders, and ordained ministers come and go. The ministry of Christ to this campus remains. May that ministry never diminish because change of persons comes about. May your prayers be more fervent, your critical intelligence be more responsibly expressed, your interest deepen, and your financial support more dedicated as a new university pastor takes the helm. So I thought that was a good way to leave. The person who came next to kind of steer the ship, basically, was Reverend Maynard Strothman and his wife. They came in 1961, And then at some point, John Simmons, he was a Disciples of Christ pastor. He also worked with Strothman during that time. And for this window of time, it was called the United Presbyterian Center. At some point, I'm not quite sure when, the name changed to the United Campus Christian Fellowship, UCCF. And my guess is the name change marked the formal beginnings of the ecumenical perspective that the Pattons had initiated. My sense about Strothman is that he lived downstairs where the students live now, and he kept the building in really, really good shape. I would imagine it, when you first buy your new car, your Cadillac, because this is long and big, you're really proud of it, you take good care of it, you're living here, so it was in great shape during his time here. When I asked Pat about just that transition between Patton and Strothman, she kind of summed it up in this way. There was more diversity and less traditionalism. The hippie era was approaching, and race, gender, and civil rights coming to the fore as issues for campus ministers. A range of groups met in the building. Older people who remembered Westminster Hall and later the UPC struggled with this. They wondered if the building was being used in a proper Christian way. Gay rights, women's rights, Native Americans, blacks were all seeking justice. The seeds of these issues were about ready to sprout. The Strothmans presided over the UCCF in a very dramatic era of change in the United States. The Civil Rights, Vietnam War. They were ministering to the under 25 generation, which Time magazine named Man of the Year in 1967. So they didn't pick one person, they named a whole group of people. And I quote Time, "This generation of students was educated, assertive, independent, and highly unpredictable. They were impatient with the speed of social change and characterized with a sense of immediacy." So they saw injustice and they sought to change. I think this is from the Jayhawk Plunge. This was a private pool, and for 25 cents, white kids could swim. African American kids were not allowed. This is, just a great example of the inequity in the 1960s here in Lawrence. The struggle to build a municipal swimming pool everyone could enjoy was longstanding. The voters of Lawrence voted this down in 1956, 61, and 63. So this issue was clearly a rallying point for young African Americans and those concerned about justice. And there was a belief that, these anti-discrimination laws that had been passed in the early 60s and the goodwill of people just stating they believed in equity, it just wasn't happening because on the ground, your kid couldn't go swimming. So it's very complicated. If you own that pool, you should be able to determine who comes into the pool. Property rights is a touchy issue here in America. So many people, black and white, were angry. Many chose violence as a means for change, and this was met with the same force in the form of police, National Guard, sheriff, tanks on Iowa Street. Change would be negotiated, and the pastors of the ECM would help be a mitigating force among contentious groups demanding equity. Otto Zing and Rafael Sanchez. Thanks to the internet, I tracked down Otto, and he has just been a joy to interact with. I've had many conversations with him on the phone, and he's so supportive of what we're doing here and just how special this building is. So he's been fun to talk to. His wife was obviously with him during this time, and I think he had a couple kids. They chose not to live here because, you need to keep work and your life separate, which is probably a good idea. I think Sanchez and Baldwin are still alive. The three of them were here during the turbulent years during 68 through 73. And I think it was during this era that the ECM represents a significant contribution to our community. Just due to the turbulence. I interviewed Rick Mitchell. Many of you know him, and he was a student during this time, and I felt like he summed it up for the students here. There was a feeling among some students that we indeed could change the world right now. We meant it. We believed it. We were saying to our parents' generation, we're not going to do that anymore. We had serious optimism. So, I mean, wow, what passion there. It's interesting to note that Zing came to Lawrence to interview for this position the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, April 4th, 68. So I was thinking, little did he know that the times that he was going to be here in Lawrence, it would be some of the most turbulent times since Quantrill and the Raiders sacked Lawrence. I mean, can you think of another time where it was more violent than that time versus the 60s and the early 70s? So when Zing shows up, he comes into this building and it's just everything's pristine and beautiful and modern, and he said it just felt almost sterile, kind of institutional. So he made a decision, along with Sanchez, to open the door. The place was going to be welcome, as it feels today. The door is open, come on in. So there was kind of a philosophical shift, I think, that happened when he came around. And also, as campus ministers do, they meet the needs of the students. So, I mean, he was sensitive to the fact that this building could serve a purpose, a new purpose. So he states, our building was used as a starting point for advocacy groups for civil rights, anti-war movement, women's rights, the American Indian movement, the Gay Liberation Front. Many groups formed in our building. They named their groups so they could legitimize themselves to the KU administration or whatever institution they were confronting. If a group had a name and a structure, they could negotiate space to meet on campus and advance their goals. Always, the students seemed to be operating from a peace and justice framework. Kind of pressed him on that. It's like, did you ever have any problems? Anybody tear anything up? No. Everybody seemed to be very respectful of this building. There was not a lot of chaos here. And C.J. Brune, she was a student here during that time also. Interestingly enough, never met the pastors here, but she was in the building a lot, because it was a great place to meet and organize and converse with people. She says the main room on the first floor would fill up during meetings. It was exciting. Lots of ideas exchanged and planning for rallies, marches, and events. She remembers the ECM was a safe place to meet. We did much planning regarding speakers that were out of the mainstream, such as Dr. Spock, Abby Hoffman, Norman Thomas. It was the site of teach-ins on subjects like the Black Power movement in Oakland. So a lot of good stuff happened here. And as we all know, the location of the ECM is significant. 90% of the people who were involved in leftist issues lived in Oriad, just next door. The ECM was right in the middle of Oriad and KU, and it was the logical place for large groups to meet. Many people remember April 20th, 1970, a multi-million-dollar arson took place at the Student Memorial Union. The building was gutted. They never found the perpetrators. On April 21st, the next day, Governor Docking placed the city under dusk to dawn curfew. More arson and firebombing, sniper fire continued. There was some incidents at the high school where, sense of injustice was happening there. 150 African-American high school and junior high students, parents, and other supporters, many carrying clubs and baseball bats, assembled at Veterans Park. They crossed the street and passed police officers and broke school windows. Helmeted Lawrence police formed a line in front of the administration building and used tear gas to disperse the demonstrators and made several arrests. So people were on fire, and so were buildings. 2 people were killed during the summer of 1970. Here's the funeral of Rick Dadal. He was a 19-year-old African-American who was shot by police in East Lawrence, July 16th. And then just down the street at 1241 Oriad, where the gaslight was, Nick Rice, 19-year-old white student who had just finished his freshman year, was shot. Just somehow he was in a crowd of people and he was shot there on the sidewalk. Sanchez and Zing, including Zing's spouse, Elaine, were instrumental in mediating among the various players during this tenuous time. Some say without the support of the core group of community pastors mediating, there could have been riots in Lawrence. This was really interesting. When I asked Otto about, okay, what's the most significant thing out of your time, 1968 through 76, what stands out as being most prominent? he surprised me. He said the most controversial issue happened in 69 or 70 when the Gay Liberation Front asked for space. What do they want to do? They just want to meet and talk. But that was a really big deal. And today, in my mind, it doesn't seem like it should be such a big deal, but it was. In 1963, homosexuality was classified as a mental illness. I mean, you were mentally ill if you were gay. It's a pretty intense name for your group because it sounded like sort of a support group, but it was more than that. They wanted space and they wanted to be recognized and they didn't want to be mentally ill, right? So anyway, it was a big deal, and Otto told me they had a conference and they had invited theologians, and they hashed all of this out, and it was up to the board to say yay or nay, and 20-1, whoever was on the board, 20 people said yay, and they let them meet. And guess what? They met right there around the fireplace, because the fireplace is sort of like our home. It's a place where we meet. You feel comfortable to relax and converse. And I interviewed one man who still lives here in Lawrence. He actually came to Lawrence to go to KU. He lived in western Kansas. He had never felt comfortable being himself, stating that he was gay. He came to KU because of this group. He remembers meeting around the fire with people, women and men were there, and it was the first time that he felt comfortable in his whole life. Wow. First time. And it was just because a group of people circled up and shared a common experience that was very special to him. So without this building, there you go. Maybe that wouldn't have happened. This gentleman also shared with me that he had a brother in the Air Force, and he was telling his brother he was going to go to this meeting, and the brother said, be careful. If you want to get involved with law or politics, there's this communist fear here that somehow that was linked with this group. Another disenfranchised group was the American Indian movement, who asked for space here. And that was another contentious one, because some thought, well, they should be getting their needs met at Haskell. But that was a big debate also. And they had requested space right after Leonard Peltier had they had the shootout, and there was some violence there. But again, they were granted space. Nothing happened. No violence. Okay, victories. Zing was very proud of the Life Planning Center that was here. It was a resource with books and magazines about decision-making processes regarding life decisions. I have to throw in also that, the city of Lawrence, the voters finally approved the municipal pool in 1967. So we got our pool finally. And also fair housing ordinance was passed. So it wasn't okay to discriminate against people when they were seeking housing. Another important group that was formed here after Robin Morgan spoke at the union, a group of women actually came back here. They planned all night. They took over the East Asian Studies building, which was pretty aggressive and controversial, but they did it. The planning for that happened here, whether you support that or not. It happened here, and believe it or not, a lot of their demands were met. That's where the women's studies program started. Out of that, you could get the pill at Watkins after that. Hilltop was founded. So a lot of good things started from that frustration. Zing, in 1975, Zing just felt like, the war was over, and the tide had changed for the campus, and people were coming to school to get a job, and self-awareness was not as big as it was. But they still offered, were supportive of various groups meeting, and definitely were supportive of different types of religious programs taking place in the building.
We're not going to say much about the 70s and 80s. This building at that time was still called United Ministries in Higher Education, continued its mission of campus ministry, welcomed various groups. The thing to know about that time is that this building was often in danger then. There were moments when it was unclear whether or not the ministry would survive. At a certain point, we don't know exactly when, became known under its current name, the Ecumenical Christian Ministries. Other denominations have since been welcomed into that group of denominations that are sharing resources here. Somehow the building remained open, and when Thad Holcomb was hired in 1991, he began the process of rebuilding the board to the cohesive unit that it is today. He welcomed students into the apartments downstairs to reinitiate the intentional community with its spirit of cooperative living, and to reinvigorate the ECM while meeting the needs of the various student groups and lonely students who find their way eventually to this very important site. That's kind of the end of our formal story. We've kind of been making the argument that this building is significant and it's worth saving because it has been so intricately interwoven with the very important things that have happened in Lawrence and at KU over the past 50 years, and that it houses a particular memory of those years that really needs to be preserved. Throughout those years, peace and social justice have been the threads that have kind of bound people together under this roof. The doors are open, they're welcoming to everyone, and this building fulfills just a vital function for our community. It's the front porch of KU where one part of the community greets. We're going to conclude with some words from Bayless Harsh. She said, "The ECM teaches compassion and acceptance. It is seamlessly interwoven into campus life and the life of this town. It is part of the fabric of this community. It is a well-known and easily identifiable place." Now what we'd like to do, we'd like to invite you to just appreciate with us some of the features, the beauties of this modern building. So we're going to start with just a few words about the interior.
First of all, look above you. Is that the coolest ceiling tile ever? I mean, polka dot ceiling tile. I love that. I think I've seen that one other place in a basement of a home on Harvard. Then look at these fixtures. I mean, wow. Look, they're actually 3 feet across, and they sort of look like flying saucers to me. Wow, what a fireplace. I think that's 8 feet across and then 8 feet tall, the top of the red part. And then, you know, the marriage of the staircase and the fireplace, how it curves around there, and how is that concrete suspended like that? I don't understand how that works, but it's beautiful. The aluminum railing just kind of follows that staircase up. I love the lines. That's what modern architecture is. It's just simple lines. There's not a lot of ornamentation. Everything is very simple and bold, striking. Look at the chairs that you're sitting on. Those were designed by Charles and Ray Eames, 2 of the most important American designers. They've survived 50 years of hard use, and they look great. There's lounge chairs over in the corner. Those are a little bit more comfortable. There's Eames sofas downstairs. They're just strong, beautiful, simple pieces of furniture that have really withstood the time, and they're still making these. So, you know, that says a lot too. The upstairs, another thing I like about modern architecture is the use of glass. Upstairs in the chapel, we have north and south, tremendous views, especially to the north. You see the Wakarusa Valley. You can see downtown. We are at the top of the hill, and it's just beautiful, all of that light. The altar up there is beautiful. It's about a 7-foot cross by 3.5 feet. Beautiful hardwood, but there's little circles that are made out of aluminum that are inserted between the 2 pieces of wood. That table is original too. That's called the Lord's table. This is the tower with the very modern cross on top of the tower, if you look at that today. And there's this really simple, beautiful pattern all over this building. Where did they come up with that? Pretty neat. Then, of course, we're always greeted by Christ, the foundation stone, when we walk in the building. And I understand there's all sorts of little goodies in there. Okay.
Thank you
so
all
much.
so much.
Thank you.